At 9:42 a.m. on July 13, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Grubb Culin watched General Omar Bradley step out of a jeep near St. Lo, knowing the next 30 seconds would determine whether 3,000 American tanks could break through Normandy's bocage. Culin was 29 years old, with 2 weeks of testing his device and zero official approval. First Army had lost over 400 Shermans in 6 weeks trying to cross the Norman hedgerows. The hedgerows weren't hedges. They were earthen walls 12 feet high and 4 feet thick, reinforced by centuries of root growth piled up by French farmers since medieval times. When American tanks tried climbing over these ancient barriers, they exposed their 1-inch belly armor. German Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank guns aimed for that precise spot. Most Sherman crews burned before they could bail out. Culin's unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron from the 2nd Armored Division, had been probing these deadly hedgerows since June 20th. The math was simple and deadly. Every battalion had approximately 70 tanks, but only 4 M4 dozer tanks were allocated, and those were slow and priority targets. Between June 6th and July 10th, American forces had advanced only 8 miles inland. At the current rate, First Army would need 6 months to advance 20 miles. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive, demanded rapid armored movement. But nobody had solved the tactical problem. Engineers tried explosives with minimal effect. Some crews welded spare track links to their hulls, which helped against machine gun fire, but failed against Panzerfausts. Others attempted ramming, only to bury their Shermans nose first into the packed earth and 500-year-old roots. Culin had spent 3 days building his solution from salvaged German Czech hedgehogs, 3 railway iron beams welded into a jack shape, originally intended to rip landing craft hulls. He took 4 2-inch thick sections of this steel and welded them to a light tank's bow plate, angling the prongs forward 35 degrees. When the tank hit a hedgerow, the steel tusks dug into the base instead of climbing over. 7 successful breaches on a light tank. Then Major Sidney Bingham ordered a test on a full-weight 33-ton Sherman. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion volunteered his crew. The 320-pound assembly was welded onto Green's Sherman on July 8th. After 5 successful tests, word reached Bradley. Bradley pointed to a hedgerow 200 yards away, a 12-foot-high fortress wall that had stopped American armor for 42 days. Green climbed in, the driver started the engine, and Culin stood next to Bradley. Green's voice crackled over the radio. "Ready? Proceed," Bradley ordered. The Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour. The 4 steel prongs struck the earthen wall with a sound like a freight train collision. Dirt exploded. For 3 seconds, the Sherman pushed against 500 years of compacted earth and root systems. Then the prongs bit through, the hedge collapsed, and the Sherman burst through the other side in 14 seconds. Bradley walked to the gap, touched the torn earth, and then turned to Major General Leonard Giraud. "How many of these can we produce?" Giraud looked at Culin. "The beach obstacles provide enough steel for approximately 500 devices." Bradley's reply was simple. "I want 3,000. Bradley issued orders to the 52nd Ordnance Group that evening. Every available welder in Normandy would work 24-hour shifts. Every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg was to be stripped. The cutting device was to be installed on every Sherman, light tank, and tank destroyer in First Army. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, 12 days away. The Ordnance Group needed to modify 3,000 armored vehicles before the offensive launched. That meant 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, or 1 tank every 6 minutes. Captain James Dougherty from the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived at the production site near Columbia on July 14th with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. The process required 4 hours per vehicle if everything worked perfectly, but nothing did. The hedgehog steel was harder than standard, overheating the cutting torches. The first day's production yielded only 8 completed devices out of 3,000. At that rate, they wouldn't finish until October. Culin spent July 15th troubleshooting. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies and organized the welders into rotation shifts. Production increased to 22 devices that day. Still insufficient. Dougherty brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions. By July 17th, production reached 38 devices per day. The math remained brutal. 3,000 tanks. 38 per day, 79 days total. Cobra launched in 8 days. The welding process revealed another problem. The 320-pound assembly shifted the Sherman's center of gravity forward by 6 inches, compressing the front suspension. After repeated impacts, test vehicles showed stress fractures. If the springs failed in combat, the tank would be immobilized. Culin modified the mounting system, adding reinforcement brackets to distribute weight, which added 30 minutes to each installation but prevented suspension damage. By July 19th, 6 days before Cobra, production reached 64 devices per day. They had completed approximately 400 modifications. 2,600 tanks remained. Bradley's staff sent a priority message. The general wanted a minimum of 2,000 Rhino tanks for the offensive. Dougherty found more steel, additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach, enough for 5,000 devices. The bottleneck was now welding capacity. Culin organized tank recovery. Teams with welding equipment into auxiliary production cells. 15 additional welding stations came online. July 21st, production jumped to 112 devices per day. The deadline pressure intensified. Welders worked through the night under floodlights. July 22nd, 3 days before Cobra, production total reached 2,200 devices. Dougherty calculated they could install another 850 before the offensive, for a total of 2,050 Rhino tanks, just above Bradley's minimum. Then the steel ran out. The ordnance group had processed every beach obstacle. Dougherty shifted to a hybrid model, Culin hedgehog cutters for remaining steel, and railroad prongs, heavier but available for everyone else. July 23rd, 2 days before Cobra, the count reached 1,800 devices, with another 500 in progress using railroad steel. Final estimated total, 2,300 Rhino tanks, 77% of Bradley's armor, not 3,000, but enough. The modified tanks moved to forward assembly areas on July 24th. Culin walked through the staging zones, watching columns of Shermans roll past, every single one carrying 4 steel prongs on its bow. They looked absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped for battle. Operation Cobra would begin with a massive air bombardment at dawn. July 25th. Culin hadn't slept in 72 hours. His hands were covered in burns. He stood in that field and understood that those steel prongs represented 14,000 men who might survive the bocage breakout. Whether the devices actually worked in combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. July 25th, 6:11 a.m., the ground near St. Lo shook as 1/500. Allied bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. At 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks crossed into the bocage. Radio reports started coming through at 8:15 a.m. Company B's lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour, struck the earthen wall, and pushed through in 16 seconds. No damage. More reports followed. Company C breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes. Company A pushed through 5 consecutive hedge lines without stopping. The pattern repeated. The Germans weren't prepared. Their defensive doctrine assumed American tanks would climb over, exposing vulnerable belly armor. When the Rhinos punched straight through at ground level, the German firing solutions became worthless. By 10:30 a.m., 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles, a distance that normally took 3 days. The bocage defensive network was collapsing. Hedgerows that had stopped tanks for 6 weeks were now just obstacles that delayed advance by 15 seconds. But the devices weren't perfect. Reports of failure started, coming in around 11 a.m. A. Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward, trapping the tank. 2 men died getting out. Another failure, a light tank's prongs, broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. A third, a tank destroyer with railroad prongs, hit a hedge at 30 miles per hour, too fast, buckling the mounting brackets and jamming the track. The failure rate was approximately 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92. Devices would fail during Cobra, with 460 men potentially trapped. The failure reports gnawed at Culin, but most reports were positive. At 1:30 p.m., a report changed everything. a battalion from 3rd. Armored Division reached the Marigny-Saint Gilles Road 4 miles inland in 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. By 3 p.m., advanced elements were 5 miles inland. The bocage terrain that protected the Germans had become useless. Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment at 4:15 p.m. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond projections. Estimated German casualties were 3 times higher than American losses. Culin drove back to the abandoned production site. He sat on a Jeep hood and processed it all. 4% failure was a cost of design gaps, but 2,200 devices worked. The math was clear. 4% failure was better than 60% casualties from exposed belly armor. The front had moved 8 miles in 1 day. On July 26th, Bradley's headquarters issued production orders for additional hedgerow cutters for units advancing beyond the bocage. By July 28th, the production count reached 2,150 modified tanks, representing approximately 60% of First Army's armored vehicles. The geographic spread was remarkable. 2nd, Armored Division used them from Saint-Lô to Coutances. 4th Armored Division used them advancing toward Brittany. Different units adapted the basic design. The 747th Tank Battalion preferred the heavy railroad prongs. Culin's lighter hedgehog steel version became the 2nd Armored Division standard. Maintenance units developed field repair procedures. The tactical impact extended beyond breaching. German units retreated faster because they couldn't establish defensive positions. American armor advanced 40 miles in 8 days. The Falaise pocket formed because German units couldn't escape encirclement through the bocage. Captured German officers called the devices hedge devils or iron tusks. One German company commander reported his anti-tank gun crew fled after watching 3 Shermans punch through hedges they considered impenetrable. By August 5th, the bocage campaign was effectively over. Bradley's staff calculated the Rhino devices accelerated the breakout by approximately 4 to 6 weeks. Statistical impact: American tank casualties dropped 37% between July 25th and August 10th. That represented approximately 300 tanks not destroyed and 1,500 crew members not killed or wounded. Not all units kept their devices. The 320-pound weight penalty affected fuel consumption, and by mid-August, approximately 40% of Rhino tanks had removed their cutters. But the devices were still in use on September 2nd when American forces liberated Paris. French civilians didn't know what the strange metal tusks meant. American tankers knew those prongs represented the difference between dying in a Norman field and reaching Paris. Culin was reassigned to training duties. On August 15th, a courier delivered a message from Bradley. The general wanted to see him immediately. Culin drove to headquarters wondering if his 4% failure rate was the cause. Bradley was waiting. He opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. A recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley himself. You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct, Bradley said. Your hedgerow cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 500 American lives. Culin, a sergeant who had only welded some steel to tanks, was receiving the 4th highest military decoration. The device is officially designated the Culin hedgerow cutting device in Army records. You earned this. The ceremony took place on August 20th near Saint-Lô. Lieutenant Charles Green, who had breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra, was present. News of the award reached other Allied armies. The British produced 300 similar designs, and the Canadians manufactured 200. The Culin device appeared in training manuals by September. The tactical lesson remained. Field improvisation using available materials could solve problems that stopped entire armies. Culin returned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron on August 25th, resuming regular reconnaissance work. He reached the Elbe River in April 1945. The war ended. He returned to Cranford, New Jersey, married Bernice Enright, and found work with Schenley Industries, a spirits company nothing to do with tanks. The story became a local newspaper feature, but national recognition was limited. General Bradley changed that. In his 1951 memoirs, A Soldier's Story, he included detailed descriptions of the bocage problem and Culin's solution, writing that the device was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army. for more than 5 weeks.